Good afternoon, OLLI members and others. This is Susan Hoffman, the director of the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at UC Berkeley. And today we have the special treat of an old friend of mine. We were just counting the decades that we've known each other. It is Roberto Bedoya, who is the cultural manager of the Oakland Arts Commission. Cultural Affairs Manager of the City of Oakland is the official title. He has just recently shepherded a plan for the City of Oakland, but his commitment to the arts and to artist-centric work has been over the last 4 decades. I met him when he was the literary manager for Intersection for the Arts here in San Francisco. We met up later when he was the Arts and Humanities program person for the Getty Center on the Arts. And after that, he was the executive director of an association, National Association of Artist-Run Organizations. And then for the last while, he has been serving as the lead in the Cultural Affairs Department for Tucson and Pima, and now has come to us to Oakland. Some things also about his background is that his leadership is sought out by the likes of the Rockefeller Foundation, Creative Time in New York City, and many others. I have been reflecting upon what Oakland needs, what the Bay Area needs, and knowing that we've had the worst challenge of situations now with COVID-19. And I just have to say, I am really glad that we have Roberto Bedoya heading the cultural work, not only for the City of Oakland, but for, in some sense, for the country. He also serves on the National Grantmakers for the Arts, which is a very instrumental group around what's happening with public and private fundraising for the arts and culture. So today, Roberto Bedoya, you have the floor.
Okie dokie. Let's see if, first of all, am I on? Can you see me?
Yeah.
Very
Yeah.
good. What I'm going to do today is show you images from my PowerPoint about the cultural plan. And it's going to be a quick run through on that. And then I'm going to read an essay, a part of an essay I wrote for an organization in Philadelphia. The title of my talk before COVID-19 was called The Aesthetic Speech of the City. So in some ways, I don't want to drift too far away from that frame. But I want to talk a little bit about the work with the cultural plan, my thoughts about city life, and what I call the aesthetic speech of the city, and maybe sort of some commentary about where we're at right now in this moment. So, first image, that's the cover of the plan. We spent a whole year doing it. It was finally adopted, and this is my team. I don't want to go. I just want to underscore Vanessa Wong, who was my lead consultant, who worked on me with that. Alex Worth, who's a graduate student at Berkeley, assisted me on the data part. It had been 30 years since we had a plan, the City of Oakland. So the first part was to adopt this plan with the vision of cultural equity that is informing my work, and how we kind of pivot from the knowledge in the plan to incubate some new programs. That's Franco Gower Plaza outside of City Hall. It's going to be interesting to see what that looks like once we get back out on the street and public gatherings are reduced radically. Timeline, briefly, research and discovery phase, talked to many folks in the city, 14 community engagement processes. The plan was drafted and put it out to the community for input, and then it was finally realized this data is a little bit and adapted by mayor and council in the summer of 18. There we go. And brief images of kind of the community meetings that we had. Incident, all the sites, reflections from the community were along the lines, and anybody that works in the cultural sector won't see any big surprises here. Investment, shrinking investment. This is really an astute analysis and a great stress that all of our organizations, this heated real estate market, who knows where that will lead us, but it had really a significant impact about cultural organization, their spaces, these questions about venues and funding. But as a rule, my Oaklanders talked about what they love about the city was its diversity, the environmental beauty, people, and the cultural activities. And of course, they want the world, and I'm going to give it to them as much as I can. Again, a little snapshot of my cultural community. And this I want to lean a little bit into that what we came as sort of the guiding principles to the plan and going forward, post-plan now, is these sort of values. Equity is the driving force. Culture is the frame. And belonging is the goal. So in some ways, equity is the driving, that's kind of, we're moving forward with the mindfulness of equity. Culture is the way in which we do this, and ultimately the goal is belonging, which leads us to, the work of, my little working across governments, and I'll talk about that later. But we define cultural equity. I don't need to go through this. I just kind of sent you guys my slides so that you have something. I think there's this Oakland, and Berkeley as well, and probably the East Bay, we're part of a rich history of political activism. So notions of self-determination are really strong among our community. Also, the notion of stewardship of place. The guiding principles to the work was to build trust, focus on assets, not deficits, to leverage what resources we may have, to work collaboratively, look for intersectionality. I just remember once I was at a library in Laurel neighborhood, and I used the word intersectionality, and some woman in the audience says, "What does that mean?" And I just said, just how do we work across disciplines? How do you work with the police department? How do you work with the public works department? How do you work with the homeless community? You need to look at ways in which we're linked together. And ultimately to build the capacity for civic engagement. We did an economic analysis where our nonprofit sector is about 83 million. I fund 70 organizations. The majority of them are small and mid-sized. I do not have large budgeted organizations in Oakland. The opera, the symphony, the museums in SF, Berkeley has Cal Performances and Berkeley Rep. Those are significant cultural institutions. I have the Oakland Museum, but I don't fund them. They kind of have this interesting relationship to the city. But Oakland is the home of individual artists, many, and small and mid-sized organizations. So if you play in the symphony in SF, you live in Oakland probably. So these are the domains of work that I've engaged in now. Cultural spaces, how do we deal with this real estate dilemma? neighborhood places, how do I build strong social networks? And I think I'll drift here a little bit. What we're coming out of the revolution, coming out of COVID-19, what we're going to be encounter is the fact that we need to reanimate and think about how do we build our social networks. Because everybody, in a way, we're going collectively through a civic trauma. That's not only a healthcare trauma, but also an economic one. So what's collapsed, what's weakened is our social networks. And that is the job of arts and culture. And that's the job of humanities. Business communities, commerce, they need social networks, but it's not the same thing, not the same kind of focus of work that we do. So I just talk about neighborhood vitality as essential. Culture in the civic commons. For me, that means, in the plan, what does it mean to have public art, to have festivals, all those things that we share, that we have in common in the civic space. And then again, to be mindful of equity and my job is to strengthen Oakland's cultural ecosystem, and again, to build cultural equity and to build the infrastructure for equity. So I'm just going to end there, and I want to read a little bit of a piece I wrote for an organization in Philadelphia, a neighborhood arts group that asked me to write about the notion of belonging and civic life. So the plan is called Belonging in Oakland. So when I use the term belonging, I am very mindful of the fact that I need to underscore, I talk about belonging in the context of sociology, not in terms of psychology. I'm not a shrink. I know there's a relationship between the two, but what are the systems that we animate and create that foster notions of belonging? So I'm just going to read a little bit, and then I'll start the conversation with you guys. I recently completed the shepherding of Oakland's cultural plan, Belonging in Oakland, a cultural development plan. As a cultural affairs manager for the city, which foregrounds belonging is essential to civic life. In my introduction, I state, the tagline for the plan, equity is the driving force, culture is the frame, and belonging in the code operates as a guide on how we develop the plan. We focused on how Oaklanders realize their expressive life, a term coined by Bill Ivey, the former chair of the NEA, who states, expressive life is comprised of elements, relationships, memory, aspiration, belief, end quote, which enliven culture and creativity. Oakland's expressive life is remarkable and vigorous. It's where aesthetic voices, community visions, and the social imaginary, how we live together, inform the value and belief in our public good and a robust democracy. The expressive life of belonging demands freedom that are often challenged social systems. The work of operationalizing belonging is the work that I've sort of been charged with. Part of it is it prompts and serves the civic narrative of belonging in all its beauty, temperaments, and complexities. To do this work asks that one embrace intersectionality as key to realizing belonging. To do this work is to travel without a map and to discover the figures in nature of livability. We live at a time when the gap between the world of have and have not is increasing. The wealth accumulation machine is changing our cities via gentrification and exasperations of race and class divisions manifest in politics and policies that are reshaping our social systems. Given these forces, the relationship between imagination, policy, and belonging scaffolds publicness, where we observe and imagine the plural. An understanding of public that supports kind of the phenomenological impulses to make meaning, the bringing into being, that produces belonging, that is mutable through the ongoing social actions of humans, is needed in our society. The ways of belonging, of becoming, of being is not caged in the policy world of rules and regulations. Policy sometimes can truncate the way humans give pulse to belonging when it becomes trapped in just data gathering and measurable impacts. And I'm complicit in that. My job is to have that, but also to constantly keep open the frame to how imagination works. And I guess I mentioned earlier, and I'm going to close out a little bit here on this thing and then immediately open up for questions. Trauma. I recall once where I was in a conversation with my mayor, Libby Schaff, and she was in dialogue with the novelist Tommy Orange, who wrote this great book called There, There, which is about sort of the Native American community in Oakland. And Tommy asked her, like, what's kind of the difficult part of your job? And she said, you know, I have to hold civic trauma. And I immediately knew where she was coming from. I started my job right before Ghost Ship. Ghost Ship is a civic trauma. You know, COVID-19 is a civic trauma. Elected officials have to hold that trauma. They need to think about ways in which to respond to the trauma, but not necessarily find the magic bullet. But that's the homework assignment always. So I think in the final thought on that, and I'm just going to not read the rest of my script here, is to think about trauma in the context of locales and place, and the terms placemaking, placekeeping, and place knowing. Those are all a lot of sort of language and rhetoric around all that these days, but I need to foreground that if we're engaged in cities, and we're talking about the aesthetic speech of the city, we need to think also about the cities as a just city. And what does a just city look like? What are the human rights that we are foregrounding in this moment? So I'm just going to stop there and open it up for questions. I sort of, gave you a lot in a little bit, but that's Bedoya speak. Thank you.
Roberto, thank you. Would you talk a little bit more about how you see COVID-19 affecting the arts infrastructure? We know that certainly for all those that, require public space, that's been jeopardized. But what are you seeing nationally, and what do you think between San Francisco and Oakland? Give us some compare and contrast between what you're dealing with and what the city is dealing with.
Oh, it's a good question. First of all, it's every day that unfolds, and every day there's some new knot that we have to deal with. Oakland is not a rich city. It's actually a pretty poor city. So when this whole thing unfolded, beginning of the epidemic, the city of San Francisco Culture gave an intermediary, an arts organization, a couple of million to deal with support for individual artists and arts organizations because they have money. So I didn't have any money. I don't have any money. And the city, so first of all, the fact that for the city, their priorities are shelter, to deal with food security, homelessness, our small business community. And I could see where I'm in alignment with efforts, and I talk to my organizations, my nonprofit organizations, to consider those relief funds that may be available for small businesses, and that's where they're going. I've been working with some private foundations, and we're close to figuring out how we will create a fund for individual artists in Oakland. The difference between, I joked with my colleagues in Oakland, first about their wealth, but I remember once going to a meeting there, and it was about cultural districts, and somebody said at a meeting, "Oh, well, I got 3 million set aside in the budget for cultural districts," and I joked, and I said, because I give out 1.2 million, and I thought, like, dang. I said, well, can Oakland be a cultural district? Because that's where all your artists live, you know? And we chuckled, but there was truth to that. So when I look at the ecosystem of Oakland, on small and mid-sized organizations and individual artists. So right now, the biggest hurt I'm feeling are all my contract workers, my teaching artists, my freelance media makers, writers, my performances, my organizations, which provide tremendous service to Oakland youth through summer and spring programming. It just went up in smoke. No more classes. So everybody's in this moment of figuring out what we need to do. So in some ways, we're just still in, I don't know how to say this, but I think there's still, we're in a place of hurt, and the hurt is still unfolding.
Mm-hmm. We will need to plug you in to Bill Sokol, who is a local labor lawyer who's teaching our Cutting Edge in Law course on Tuesday mornings. He is also conducting webinars for contract workers.
Yeah, I mean,
thousands of people.
To be honest, part of the challenge I feel sometimes is just a challenge of translation. For example, my nonprofit organization, somehow, how many times do I have to say, you're a small business and you need to figure out your way to get yourself in the queue for the small business administration funds? That somehow there's a translation that's not happening because I'm nonprofit. Right. And I'm not a small business, but yes, you are. Right. You know, you just don't make big monies.
Yeah, you don't make a profit. Yeah.
And, you know, the whole complexity around freelance workers, and yes, it's kind of complicated. So that's maybe the bright spot coming out of this, is that the contract workers, musicians, teaching artists, freelance writers, media folks see themselves as a workforce and start to organize themselves in a better way.
Well, I think, you know, when I was at the California Confederation of the Arts, the work had been done at Columbia University to analyze that artists were the second lowest paid job category, second to pensioners. So pensioners were first and artists were second. And it was at the time when California and the country was going through the recession in the early 1990s. And one of the things I did in representing the arts and arts organizations is join the bandwagon with religious leaders and social services to say, we need that safety net. Increase the safety net. Don't decrease it. And that was by way of saying, you know, your artists need that safety net just as much as everybody else.
Let me respond to that and encourage people. There's chat things, so you can type me a difficult question. Give me one. But let me talk a little bit about a thought that a poet friend shared with me, who was commenting about at the beginning of the president's briefings, he would always bring his experts were business leaders.
Right.
He would talk about us people as consumers. And I'm just like, wait a second, I am a consumer, but I'm a human. And so in some ways, the rush to get back to normal is also a rush to get us all sort of defined as consumers. Now, setting that aside, no, we're not all consumers. We have relationships. How are we rushing to rebuild our social networks? How are we rushing to kind of figuring out how to do parenting in this now and post-in. So I guess what I want to say is my job in the cultural affairs, because I know my community really well, we're often about the human rights that we need to assert. And we're not just consumers, a piece of property that you go out to the big department store and drop my coin.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Does anyone have a question? Can you raise your hand or we've got 2 chat questions. One that's coming from Ronnie. In the wake of COVID-19 and the resulting economic downturn, is it time to remember and revive the programs of the New Deal?
Yes, there's lots of conversations that I'm part of. It's complicated. I'm part of a network of a network called the United States Urban Arts Federation. That's the top 50 cities in the US. We get together and we talk about how we're working through this moment. We recently were on a conversation with National Endowment for the Arts, and many cities are thinking about a new WPA. Every city is involved in some kind of economic strategy, developing some economic strategy going forward. I know my city is involved in one, and arts and culture is part of a larger effort to think about businesses, small business, and economic security. I don't know if there's going to be a WPA type program funded by the feds, I would hope. But I can tell you this, some cities are thinking about doing it on their own. And cities that are wealthier than Oakland, but I'm learning from them, and my thought is along that line. I think there was a question about how are artists putting food in their mouth. It's been really interesting to be privy to a lot of relief funds. Some of them were DIY. I'm just coming together, like Zoo Labs, which is an organization in Oakland. They raised $150K. They put out a call. They were giving out 500, and it was gone in less than a week. So I mean, it's like those artists are out there looking. There's nothing. And it's troubling because philanthropy, whether it's public or private, moves slowly. And the immediate need is, I was saying earlier, is the trauma. So artists are also resilient and figuring out how to do online gigs and finding income. And this is where the relationship between artists and organizations are really important. And also, with the Government CARES Act, they're eligible for unemployment if they have a 1099. All they have to do is just show that, yes, I got a gig. I got $600 from organization X. Here's my 1099. You're eligible, and we'll see what happens.
Mm-hmm. Has there been any talk about a United Arts Fund drive in the Bay Area?
No. I think when I talk to my colleagues in Seattle and in Chicago, what they have, which Oakland and the East Bay doesn't have, is an ongoing advocacy network who was able to mobilize their political Rolodex and kind of make the case to public fundings. I mean, the San Francisco has a network that was developed in response to a ballot initiative that happened last year in which they got a little more money from their hotel tax fund. So they were able to mobilize that network to get to City Hall and get that money allocated for the arts community. We don't have that network in the East Bay. I have it informally. I mean, of course, I talked to the museum, I talked to Berkeley Rep, I talked to the symphony. I talked to all these people, and we know where we're at and how we're dealing with our hurt. But that's just, maybe we'll have a network after this, that we don't get caught off guard.
Mm-hmm. And, you know, I don't think we have to reach as far back as the WPA. We could talk about a CETA-like program.
Yeah. That was my start.
Yeah.
I started one of my first jobs was CETA Arts Program for Alameda County, and I worked in. I grew up in Hayward, Union City, in the little Latino neighborhood called Dakota, which is my first. Is the barrio, and I worked on an oral history project that ultimately, now I'm telling you East Bay stories, became the first 2 issues of the East Bay Express. I was featured, called Dakota Lives, I think it was. So anyway, yes, there's, CETA, WPA, whatever we imagine as a new jobs program. But it needs to be sort of centered in the fact that it's a job works program, and because I think people are going to need to get back to employment soon.
I'm just wondering around the cultural equity focus. If, I don't know that many people know that term cultural equity actually was defined here in the Bay Area, that term. And Devorah Major and Edsel Matthews, if you remember Edsel at the Concepts Cultural Gallery, were the ones that put together the first cultural equity policy paper.
Yes, I mean, in a city like Oakland, where the demographics to talk about the demographics of Oakland have been changing, but historically an African-American city. Right now, it's the African-American and the Latino population are about on par, about 30% of the city. It's always been, for decades, a majority minority city. So equity is kind of woven into the DNA of my organizations. And to be more specific, to look at racial equity is an interesting undertaking, because the East Bay is not only just the home to wonderful arts community, it's also the home to the disability rights movement. God bless Berkeley and all the kind of those activists. I just saw that movie on Netflix. Was it Crimp Camp something or other? Yeah, it was really good. But there's a lot of Berkeley in it, and but the fact that in Oakland I have access stands, I have as a first dance company, to deal with disability. So the question of equity has many different dimensions. But when you kind of look at racial equity and the that world of have and have-nots and politics of resource and positions, it's I'm involved in an analysis when I'm doing research. Who knows? I'll have more data afterwards in about 6 months, further to that point.
Mm-hmm. We have a chat question. And
Can't read it very clearly.
yeah, let me read it to you. It is, in seeking equity, will there ever be an American culture?
It's a good question. Sure. The American culture that maybe the president doesn't acknowledge is our diversity. We're all shapes and sizes. That's American culture. I think the problem is, let me back up a little bit here and get a little philosophical, in the sense that I want to refer to a quote by the Jewish philosopher named Emmanuel Levinas, who says, "We is not the plural of I." And I think what we as a nation often reduce the meaning of we to me and my friends, and don't understand the meaning of we as a secular space that includes people you don't know. So in some ways, that America, that question was about, is that secular space. It includes all shapes and sizes, political opinions as well. I think where the tension and maybe the animosity, as opposed to antagonisms, is like when people say, no, it's fixed. It's me and my friends. We're American and you're not. Listen, I'm a brown person in America. My whole life has always been about othering. And you have to, Berkeley and the East Bay and Oakland have been really profoundly lucky to have John Powell as a thought leader here and his othering institution, the Othering Center, Belonging and Othering, John Powell. He writes eloquently about racial justice, and he's a great thought leader. He teaches at Berkeley. Come on, Susan, give me a tough one.
Well, this is a little bit of a side issue from what you've been talking about, but when you and I spoke about a month ago, we were both alarmed at hearing that the San Francisco Art Institute was going to cease to exist. And, I know my membership knows the San Francisco Art Institute, and they know, its long history of really positioning California, the visual arts, the conceptual arts, you name it. Do you want to speak to the issue around what it means to lose an institution like the Art Institute?
Well, it's a tremendous loss, but I also will speak to the fact that they've been on the ropes for a good decade. Mm-hmm. And I can't talk about that. But I will talk about what this pandemic has exposed is sort of the fault lines in how our cultural institutions are capitalized. Big institutions can carry debt, small ones can't. So when all of a sudden the money runs out and you got your debt, that's a big problem to solve. So my small and mid-size, unfortunately the nonprofit sector has too much debt, and it's not necessarily all bad. You do need to know how to carry debt in order to move forward. I'm not an economist, but about that. But the fact that the structural deficits that institutions carry forward are being revealed, and institutions have to respond to that. But I want to talk also about our large budget cultural institutions. I don't recall all the details, but when the Kennedy Center got a chunk of change in the first round of stimulus money, there was community alarm shortly thereafter that they laid off their symphony. They laid off their cultural workers, and they kept the money to keep the administrative house in order. Okay, that's an understanding. But the fact that you don't think that your content is worthy of support and you're laying off musicians, they're union musicians, and maybe they're expensive, but never like there's a politic. The fact that most museums, they're laying off their education department. And the education departments are the people that are making those bridges between working poor, communities of color. It's the education department that kind of welcomes them into that house. So, there's a whole politic around how majors operate and what they need and what they do. But that's, I just got my little cultural affairs department.
Mm-hmm. Do we have another question? Did somebody raise their hand?
No.
Well, there are enormous problems in this situation. It's hard to get a purchase point around how to organize some of the solutions and some of the recovery. I'm glad that you're talking to the National Endowment for the Arts. Has the California Arts Council been helpful at all? Is it possible that the Newsom administration might be more receptive to the issues?
I don't know the answer to that question. I was on a Zoom call with the chairperson and the director earlier this week. I don't know what they're going to do with their NEA money yet, but they're thinking about how to respond. I just would say that they're pretty empathetic. They're approachable. I mean, in Alameda County, I asked for some information about Alameda County, and we have many arts organizations in this county outside of my city, but like Livermore and Fremont and Hayward, they all get like $5,000 from the California Arts Council to support the little municipal gallery. That's an important part of our ecosystem,
right?
Cultural ecosystem.
Well, I think what's difficult for California is that I think we have, well, certainly for the Bay Area, we have more artists per capita than almost any other place outside of New York. Right?
And the diversity of those artists are really interesting. In Oakland, obviously, I have a robust cultural activist community. I have also artists that are Hermetic writers, maybe associated with mills, who are sitting there writing their experimental poetry that aren't about community engagement per se. The East Bay is lucky to have such wonderful experimental musicians, Rova, Paul Drescher. These people are constantly doing their work in a way, imagining the evolution of a form of an artistic form. At the same time, I have artists that are all about community engagement, who self-defining themselves as cultural strategists, meaning that now my work means I make the object, I make the policy argument, I do the community organizing, and ... I like to joke to my grantees that the charge of my commission is that I need to support everybody from the white gloves to the anarchists. And of course, I don't have enough money for everybody, but I'm very mindful of the fact that's who's out there. That is, looking to the city to affirm and validate their form.
Well, Jane Nielsen has a question, and I just found a way to unmute her. Jane, do you want to ask your question?
Well, a lot of philanthropists support arts organizations just as a matter of their own philosophy. Is there any evidence of wealthy philanthropists coming forward to help the arts now, since they're in such dire straits?
Yes, I mean, let me respond to
Was not
a couple, what? I'm sorry. What I saw happening in philanthropy right now, especially in the Bay Area philanthropists, that their first response was to look at their current grant portfolio of grantees and making sure that they were healthy and strong and find additional resources for them. So it makes perfect sense. This is like, you know, I'm a foundation and I've supported a mid-sized organization, and I want to make sure that they're moving forward. Now we're at this point in which we're an active conversation about us talking about how can we respond regionally to this moment in time. I'll shout out the Rainian Foundation in Oakland as being exemplary, figuring out what they can do. Hewlett is a really interesting one because they've always had a commitment to general operating support, and they continue to do that. Everybody's in dialogue to figure out what is the best way to proceed. Right now, at this week, it's focused on individual artists. Next week, it may be focused on organizations. So there is a collective will, a collective passion, and now the work we're at today is to figure out how to gather those resources and put them into play. I guess going to say philanthropy is an interesting beast, and sitting on the board of grant makers in the arts, I kind of know what's happening nationally. Mellon, New York Foundation, which funds them nationally, is, you know, again, going to their grantees. So they're pretty much the symphony, the operas, the museums of the nation. And they're going to continue to do that. So everybody's figuring out what they need to do, you know?
Yeah, very definitely. And it sounds like what we need to do is be back in touch with you and say the next couple of months. I mean, there are survival needs right now, which are going to be hard pressed for individuals to help address. But I think if we could build some leadership around more of a recovery set of funds, if it's at the state level, the national level, the Bay Area, and a mix of private and public funds, it certainly is what's going to be needed.
Sure. And what I'm going to say to that, I want to underscore the satisfaction I feel with my cultural plan, because it gave me a roadmap on how to move forward. And it was different than it was before. So in some ways, we need to pivot at this moment in time to not fall back to our old ways of maybe reinforcing inequities, and just think about different ways in which a moment of trauma can generate some healthier and more just work. I'm incredibly thankful for my community and the embrace of the cultural plan, even though I have very little resources, to actually provide me a roadmap on how to, what I think is going to be the most significant work that lies ahead for the cultural sector is the rebuilding of social networks. And to underscore what I've said at the very beginning, this sense of belonging. How do we belong to each other? And that's what the arts do. They feed that part of our souls. And so I think that's I got distracted by my iPhone, who tells me my boss wants this information. Anyway.
Well, we'll let you go in just one more minute then. In rebuilding the social, the social networks, you're talking about not only artist to artist, but you're also talking about the artist's role in the community, or the artist's role in public services, the artist's role in a variety of forms, I would try.
Sure. I mean, and it's not easy. So when I use the word intersectionality, nice word, I'm sure somebody's got a PhD from Berkeley. They're going to tell me all about it. Mm-hmm. But what I will know, that it's not easy, that the culture of arts, my arts community, and the culture of the Department of Transportation, there's two different languages. Mm-hmm. And how do you do that work together when you really need to know each other's language as a first step? That's kind of where we're at right now. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's more money in transportation than there is in.
So I did a small project with. Yeah. I have a cultural strategist in residence at the Department of Transportation. This is before everything went haywire, and the director, Ryan, said, "Oh yes, I'll have one. Well, have paint the intersection." I said, "No, Ryan, that's not what I want. They're a thought partner. Uh-huh. How do you imagine routes?" Uh-huh. And if you ask an artist to think about routes, it's going to be different than an engineer. And I want both of those forms of knowledge to exist in your shop. So when you make your decision, the best example of artists working in municipal government is in Minneapolis, but they've been at it for 15 years. Mm-hmm. And now the cultures of government understand what it means to have a cultural strategist in residence. Mm-hmm. So that groundwork has already been done.
Mm. And a cultural strategist is there plugging in those conversations with other.
Yeah, I mean, they're basically hired to be sort of like a thought partner in kind of activities. The cultural strategists that we had in the Department of Planning really worked on their engagement strategies, because you always are going out and having meetings and having discussions about planning and plannings. What happened if you had an artist, they did have an artist, to come in there and to figure out what does that engagement platform look like?
Mm-hmm. And I think we should just take one more question. And Jane, thank you for asking this. Jane's comment is, I worry that large gatherings such as you have with live theater and concerts may not be allowable.
That's probably true. It goes back to it goes back to the imagining we have to do around social networks. It's not that we're doing Zoom, I hate it, but I'm not totally in isolation. And what does small gatherings look like? That's a really, really big job for imagination. And I think we all have imagination. I think it's doable. I think what's going to be hard on the economy, my city, San Francisco in particular, all of us are tied to a transit occupancy tax. Mm-hmm. So those monies are shrinking. Mm-hmm. What does it mean to the operations of cultural affairs departments across the country? What does it mean to festival culture? I mean, the Berkeley Book Festival went online. Mm-hmm. Beloved festival. But it's not the end of the world, but it's the end of the world as we know it.
Mm-hmm.
And
right.
it's going to be sad, when you don't, except the Warriors don't live here anymore. But when those Warrior parades were out in front of City Hall, I loved it.
Yeah, truly. Roberto, thank you very much for taking the time off from a very heavy duty commission work. And thank you for the insights. And all of the members who've joined us today, thank you for listening, and also thank you for your questions. It is very likely that this may become a podcast for Berkeley Talks. And so we will notify you, Roberto, and we'll also let the members know as well. Any
Very
final
good.
words?
Very good. Thank you all.
Okay, thank you. Take care.